Hey everyone, so I recently went on a trip to the grocery store and I found something about beef patties. Now you might be wondering, I decided to do a little comparison between the fresh ground beef patties, which are a little bit more expensive, and the frozen beef patties that you find in the freezer section. There's a huge difference between the two, and in this video we're going to talk about these differences and kind of dive into the good, the bad, and the ugly about it. So admit it, we've all kind of wondered what the story is behind these frozen beef patties versus the fresh beef patties, right? Say you're gonna have a backyard barbecue with the kids or for a birthday party or something. You're trying to feed a lot of people. You don't want to spend an arm and a leg to do it. So you consider about just going for the frozen beef patties that you see over in the freezer counter. The ones that are really cheap and you can get 10 for $8 or something like that, right? But is there a big difference between those patties and the actual ground beef that you see back at the meat counter? Yeah, there's a huge difference. And when I went to H-E-B, I noticed that there were just tons of selections for these frozen beef patties. And I want to be clear, this isn't H-E-B's fault. They're just catering to their consumer. And that's their prerogative, and that's what they need to do. But I actually found that in rural areas and in poor communities where people are often struggling economically, these cheap frozen patties are not just a one-off thing that people use every once in a while, but they're a source of nutrition, if you can call it that. So let's start the conversation by talking about fresh ground beef. Now, fresh ground beef is a little bit different. It's typically made from higher quality cuts of beef like chuck or round or sirloin, something like that. No doubt it costs a little bit more, but the quality is there and there's transparency with that. So the specific label of the cuts is giving you, the consumer, some transparency. Whether it's 80-20, 90-10, whatever it is, it's giving you some transparency to know that you're either buying sirloin, chuck, or round, or whatever. With the frozen patties, you have to look a little bit harder. And the fresh patties, though, often have a little bit fresher of taste. They have a little bit better texture, and it hasn't been processed or frozen usually for extended periods of time. So the fresh beef versus the frozen beef already has an advantage, even though it's a little bit more expensive. Now let's take a look at the quality of the beef from the frozen patties, right? So these frozen patties, if you look at them, they might say 100% beef, or they may say beef patties or something like this, but often they're made from beef trimmings, and that can include various parts of the cow, including the heart, the kidneys, the spleen, the intestine, just very different parts of the cow than what you would find back at the meat counter. Now, it can also include some lower quality cuts, and it can be made from mechanically separated beef. And this combines bits of meat that are kind of left on the bone, so there's no waste, things you would normally find in dog food. Now, the grade and the source of these frozen patties, often unspecified. Nobody really knows. And that makes it harder to verify the quality of the beef that you're getting. So obviously you would assume that because you're paying less, the quality is going to be lower, and that would be a fact. But there's also nutritional aspects that you have to look at. Now, when it comes to the healthiness of these two types of beef products, the fresh ground beef versus the frozen patties that you normally find over in the freezer section, fresh ground beef generally has fewer additives in it. Now, you're going to be less likely to find things like preservatives or binders or fillers, which we'll learn here in a minute, are much more common in these frozen patties. The nutritional value of fresh beef is normally more consistent. And it does depend on the fat to lean ratio, again, whether it's like 80-10 or 80-20, 90-10, something like that. The nutritional value will vary, and the flavor quality will vary as well. But there's also a shorter shelf life when it comes to the fresh beef. But be in mind that it's more minimally processed and it's more natural. So there's no preservatives, anything like that goes into this beef. So yes, it does have a shorter shelf life. But now let's take a look at the frozen beef patties. If you're looking at the ingredients list on the fresh ground beef, you'll probably notice that it's just 100% beef. Or maybe even the frozen packages, though it may say 100% beef, maybe these trimmings or these additives from the bone or the hearts or the kidneys or spleen or whatever the case may be. But they also can often contain other additives, things like preservatives or flavor enhancers or things like that could extend the shelf life or improve the taste of this lower quality dog food grade beef, if you will. And some inexpensive brands do include things that are fillers like breadcrumbs or soy or things like that. And this reduces the amount of actual beef that you'll find in these frozen patties that a lot of people are using for hamburgers or Salisbury steak or whatever they're using them for. And it's not just in the grocery stores we're seeing this problem. They're also doing this in restaurants as well. Now, one thing that I learned on this journey with the healthiness aspect of these beef products, frozen versus fresh, is the sodium content. Now, because they contain more additives on the frozen side, they generally have a lot more sodium as well. And this can improve the flavor, of course, of these lower quality products, but it can also really affect the nutritional value of these products. So something else you might want to consider as well, if you've ever been cooking these cheaper, lower quality hamburger patties that you often find in the frozen foods section, you'll notice that the fat content is usually much higher. And though it can vary widely, there may be more connective tissue in these frozen beef patties, and that can certainly affect the digestibility and the healthiness of this beef products when I went and I talked with some of the nutritional experts about this. So, we're all on a journey to live happier, healthier lives. And I think this is something that we should look at. But now let's talk about the quality of the cuts separating the frozen beef from the fresh beef, okay? So the fresh beef, it's made from recognizable cuts of beef, and that makes it more predictable. It makes it more tasteful usually, and there's a certain texture that comes with fresh beef. And this also allows for much greater customization. Like, you can add all kinds of ingredients. You can choose lean versus fattier contents depending on your preference of how you like to cook or your dietary needs or whatever. But fresh ground beef offers you options, where the frozen beef patties that you find in the freezer section generally don't. Now, they're often, as I said earlier, they're often made from trimmings and from multiple parts of the cow, the connective tissue, things like that are less desirable sections of the meat, the shanks, the neck, things like that. I mean, there's all sorts of things that people are putting in these frozen beef patties in order to make them cheap and still make a profit. Now, premium cuts for these frozen beef products are rarely used, very, very rarely used. Instead, cost-effective options dominate this market. So what we're seeing is higher fat content, lower nutritional value, and a higher fat content leads to an unhealthier product, even though it's cheap. Now, some of these very inexpensive beef patties that you find in the freezer section are often made from imported beef. And that can vary widely in quality and standards. So be careful with this. Even though it's cheap and it can feed a lot of people, it's not necessarily the best. Now, when it comes to fresh ground beef, I discovered one thing, that there's minimal processing, okay? So it's sold fresh, relatively fresh, and it must be consumed or frozen at your home rather quickly in order to maintain the quality value of this stuff. So it lacks kind of the dense, uniform texture of these frozen beef patties, and it's very common, but because it hasn't been heavily processed, it hasn't been heavily compressed, it hasn't been factory farmed as much, right? Or factory formed, I guess you could say, as much as the frozen beef patties. Now, these frozen beef patties, they're often extremely heavily processed, and this ensures uniformity in shape and weight, and even somewhat the taste is affected by this. And freezing can also really affect the texture, causing the meat to lose moisture when you cook it. So these things are really, as you can tell, there is a quality difference between the fresh and the frozen beef. And in some brands, they do what's called flash freezing. And these patties, when they do this, these patties really suffer from a freshness issue. And the quality of beef really does remain the key factor. So even if you're going frozen, you might be better off to spend just a little bit more money on the higher quality beef, something that says 100% beef or premium or grade A or something like that. So these are just some of the things that I found. Now, when it comes to taste and texture versus fresh ground beef versus the cheap frozen patties, the fresh ground beef generally has a much better taste. It's juicy, it has a much better texture, and when it's cooked properly, it's just good stuff. And it also allows for more seasoning options and preparation variants and things like that. So even though sometimes the fresh beef does seem to be a little bit more expensive, the quality and the health value is certainly there. When it comes to the frozen beef patties, especially the more inexpensive brands, the taste could be very bland, or it could be overly salty due to the preservatives or the fillers or whatever. And the texture is often, if you've ever eaten these things, is often very rubbery, and it's less juicy, and it's especially noticeable that these are lower quality cuts of beef. So certainly there is a quality difference. Folks who live in rural areas in places like rural Texas might find these frozen patties as being a good alternative, because we just don't make as much money as the people in the city oftentimes. And sometimes we have to feed fairly large families or big groups of people as cheaply as we can. These things are an option, and these frozen patties certainly do, you could argue, lead to more health issues down the road, downrange, right? So if you're looking at these as an option, they're cheap, they're quick, they're affordable, and you can feed a lot of people for relatively cheap with it. Even though the quality and the taste might suffer, and even though the nutritional content might suffer. So people who live in food deserts or semi-food deserts, they notice these things, they're cheap, they're effective, and you can feed a lot of people for a little bit of money. You know, and that's why you see them on the shelves so much and see them flying off of shelves, especially in rural areas or economically challenged areas. Okay, so here's the thing. Cheap frozen patties are not typically made from premium cuts of beef. Instead, they're often derived from lower quality cuts of beef, sometimes dog food grade, or trimmings that may include flavor enhancers or preservatives and all sorts of stuff like this to improve the texture, the flavor, and the shelf life, stuff like that. And while convenient, and while cheap, and while readily available, They generally offer much lower nutritional food value and less transparency when it comes to the buying process and about the quality of the beef that's being used. So if health, if taste, if quality are all priorities, fresh ground beef is always a better option if you can afford it. Now, however, if convenience and cost are more critical, you're probably going to go with the frozen patties, because some of the mid-range patties are made from 100% beef without fillers, no soy, no breadcrumbs, no oats, things like that. And they can be a reasonable compromise, right? So the key thing here, always check the labels. Always be aware of what you're buying, and always know the source of the ingredients, so that way you're making an informed decision. I'm journalist Matt Pierce. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation about fresh versus frozen beef. If you have, please consider liking, subscribing, comment, and share. I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you used these frozen beef patties before, or do you typically buy fresh beef? I'd like to know what you think about this. Please drop me a comment and engage in the conversation. It really helps this channel grow, and it feeds the algorithm. Nutritious stuff. So anyway, I appreciate it. That's just been this Texan's take on frozen versus fresh beef that you get at H-E-B or other supermarkets. So we'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot. Please be sure to subscribe wherever it is. All right, thanks. Take care.